I think mortgage rates will continue to soften. And I think as the Federal Reserve starts cutting and the financial markets have more certainty around what that is, because this year is really characterized by so much uncertainty around when the first cut is actually going to be. Because when you think about the December meeting, and there was so much excitement because the inflation was coming down so low, and then we saw inflation bounce back, that was really not good for mortgage rates. But I think the prospects are building for a better momentum going forward for mortgage rates. There is going to be volatility, but they are on a gradual path downward.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the next Triangle MLS podcast. We are joined today by an economist from CoreLogic who's going to be at our event on September 19th in Cary, PropTechSouth.com. Tickets are on sale now, and we're going to sell out. We did last year, so it's just a matter of how far we get into August before that happens. I encourage you to go get your tickets now so you can come meet. Selma, I want you to introduce yourself and tell us what you do at CoreLogic.
Sure. Well, thanks, first of all, for having me. I look forward to the event. So I am Selma Hepp. I'm a chief economist at CoreLogic. I've been in this role for the last couple of years. I've been with CoreLogic for about coming on 4.5 years. Prior to CoreLogic, I was a chief economist for another brokerage out of the Bay Area called Pacific Union that was later acquired by Compass, the infamous Compass. And then prior to that, I was chief economist for Trulia, the portal. And then before that, I was an economist with the California Association of Realtors, as well as the National Association of Realtors. And I also worked as a special assistant at Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I myself, at some point in time, held a real estate license in Florida and in Virginia.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Boy, that's a lot.
Well,
so
time flies.
We're really glad you're going to be with us that Thursday in September. And we have you right after the lunch break, right before our main speaker of the day is Dylan Carson, who is the former trial attorney for the DOJ. And he was involved in their antitrust department. And he's now in practice working for Manat. And in the same way as we're trying to just get, insight from Dylan to learn how to navigate 2025 with all the changes that are happening, we, want to welcome you to town and let you tell us what you think about what looks like a tick down in rates, but still such a constrained inventory situation. We have enormous inbound migration in the Triangle. Around a fifth of all the views on the internet, people looking at homes in this area come from New York City and the area around New York. So, this is gig workers and people relocating, new businesses. There's a lot of hiring going on in the Triangle still, big companies announcing moves here. Natural growth is what I mean. Yeah. And dealing with that in a place that's not that big, Raleigh is not an enormous town. So we're really interested to know what you'd want to talk to us about in September. Look at your crystal ball up, a few weeks. What would you want to say to the brokers in the Triangle about what happened next?
Well, this week we certainly didn't lack any excitement in terms of, economic backdrop and how it impacts the housing market. As you mentioned earlier, we saw a tick down in mortgage rates. I mean, that's been very exciting development, I think, for the housing market, simply because we've been in such a limbo for so long. And especially at the end of the spring home buying season when mortgage rates went up, and that really stalled the housing market in many ways. And in some of these markets where home prices have, been really increasing at a really fast pace over the last few years, that additional or extended mortgage rate, higher mortgage rate, started to really have an impact on the buying demand, and it cooled buying demand in some markets and actually led to slowing of price appreciation, if not price declines. Now, I wouldn't say that Raleigh is one of those areas. I think, like you said, you do get a lot of incoming folks from areas that are generally tend to be higher income and also have a lot of homeowners equity among existing homeowners. So what happens is when those folks migrate, they tend to have a lot of cash to work with, and that, makes them very competitive buyer in whatever market they go into. And so in markets that continue to have a lot of in-migration, we do see pressure on home price appreciation continue to build. So I think that is the case in a lot of your markets. And also as you mentioned, the supply constraint is still there. Over the course of the spring, I think what's been interesting to see is headlines around places where inventories have actually gone up a lot. And that has been the case again in these markets where we saw housing demand cooling. But that tends to be mostly Florida and Texas and some markets in between, little less so North Carolina or a little less so your particular market, just because it's such a higher education, higher income, and things like that affect your markets. So the story of housing markets continued to be one of bifurcating or diverging trends, where some markets are cooling considerably and some markets remain pretty strong. And so while you fall into these strong markets, I think there are concerns, obviously, what happens if the economy indeed slows down considerably. So now we only really had one job report that, sort of brought people to really...
Little panic there for a moment.
Yeah, a little panic. That's a good way to put it. But we'll see what happens. We'll have another report before we meet later in September. I think maybe it was a little bit of overreaction this time. But then you are hearing of, companies laying off. You are hearing of, some areas really cooling. So let's see what happens. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on that. Very close attention. Either way, I think we are on our way to more favorable mortgage rates, which will help some of those buyers on the sidelines come back in. We are also seeing a pickup in refi activity, because folks that bought over the last couple of years bought at higher rates. And so the closer we move to 6% or even lower, you'll see that refi potential, building and releasing in some way. So, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with mortgage rates. We have seen them since Monday actually pick back up a little bit. So let's see where they in fact end up. But then last thing I just want to note is, there are sort of some risks building up for existing homeowners when it comes to non-mortgage costs like insurance and property taxes that are impacting some markets as well. Again, there's strong correlation in markets where that is happening with more inventory, with cooling demand, cooling prices. So that all has been happening at the same time. We have been paying attention to that as well. So again, it's maybe not so much in your market, but it is something. I mean, there is a hurricane or a summer storm coming through.
Right. Yeah, we have a partnership with the business school at the University of North Carolina, the Keenan Flagler School. We talk a lot about insurance. That's a big story, the non-mortgage costs, as you said. I wonder if I could ask you a question, Selma. When you zoom out from the kind of play-by-play that we spend a lot of our time in because we're, inside baseball, and look at the overall growth in home equity since the market really turned up in our area in about 2016. I think it did in a lot of the country. So you starting to see these extraordinary gains in property value. And it looks like because of all the reasons we just talked about, those gains in most markets are really holding, and we're moving on into a new kind of normal looking sales cycle. That amount of equity, I tried to do the math with just the 16 counties that we're in, it didn't just occur in the houses that were for sale. It occurred in every house that everyone owns out there whose equity has gone up. Yes, their taxes have gone up, their insurance has gone up. These gains are extraordinary if you look over the past 20 years of equity in the country. I want to be able to tell the story to first-time homebuyers, to people that are aspirational still, what that means. This enormous amount of money is now sitting, and I saw a story about HELOCs the other day, and dangers associated with them, but all of that money is accessible to people for college tuition and for paying some of these costs. But that's a story that I think our industry, in the middle of less positive stories about housing and real estate in general, is a story that I think is a positive one.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I think what is a good outcome of all of this appreciation and the fact that people deleveraged, during the last refi boom in 2020, in 2021, is that they have a lot of equity, which is a huge financial buffer for people. So unlike last time, when you think about what happened coming in a great financial crisis, where people, some 25% of homeowners were in negative equity, meaning they had no equity whatsoever. This time, about 1% of homeowners are in negative equity. The rest have. In fact, the average LTV, loan to value ratio, is only about 43%, meaning that most of the borrowers have about 50% of their home value, have equity of that home value that exists, or the loan that they still own on their home, meaning that, there is the additional value from the market value of the home, right? So you have the loan that's on the home, but then there's market value, which is usually higher because you're likely put 20% down, right? So that is a huge buffer. So in many areas where we are seeing now insurance and taxes being a constraint, people are able to take seconds and tap into that equity and, still, continue to remain in their home, because otherwise, what happened coming out of the great financial crisis is people just couldn't. And then they ended up in foreclosure, and we had the foreclosure crisis. This time, the serious delinquency rate is still extremely low. It's the lowest that we've had recorded in our data. And I think the reason is that people have these alternative financial sources of finances, so it's
Backstop,
very helpful.
Yeah, that's added an enormous amount of resiliency to, I think,
Exactly.
to thousands, hundreds of thousands of families. It's part of the story that we try to tell about homeownership. We interviewed a math teacher, like middle school math teacher last year, who was able to buy a home. And we, through a program that we support. And she said the reason that she was excited about buying a home was because she knew what the payments were going to be looking out for 30 years. The stability of that was not something that she had renting. And we pointed out what a HELOC was. And by the way, if your kids need to go to college, did you know we did a CMA and your house is worth a lot more than you paid for it? And she legitimately didn't really know what that was. So part of our role is financial education and telling people that this big rise of equity is something, if you were a homeowner, would be accessible to you in fairly easy, cost-effective ways.
Right.
So that's a big positive. And we're trying to be positive. An event where the speaker after you is the Department of Justice. So
okay.
Right. Right, we have a really positive, kind of fun story to tell, Selma, about about what the market looks like next year. And it looks pretty healthy for Triangle, as long as rates at least stabilize. I think people can get their brain around these new normal. I don't think we're going to see the extraordinarily low rates that we saw before. How do you feel about that, about where rates kind of settled out?
Yeah, I think, it's unrealistic to expect rates to go back to 3% or even 4%. But, historically, if they get to 5.5, that's still historically low. The pandemic was once in a lifetime situation for many, people to yeah, right, exactly. No, that's absolutely true. And you don't want there to be a situation where mortgage rates go down to 3%, because it usually would mean some sort of a really big economic shock, So that's kind of something to keep in mind. But, I think mortgage rates will continue to soften. And I think, as the Federal Reserve starts cutting and the financial markets have more certainty around what that is, because there's still uncertain, this year is really characterized by so much uncertainty around when the first cut is actually going to be. Because when you think about the December meeting, and there was so much excitement because the inflation was coming down so low. And then we saw, inflation bounce back. That was really not good for mortgage rates. But I think the prospects are building for a better momentum going forward for mortgage rates. And so there is going to be volatility, but they are on a gradual path downward.
Well, that's a great message anyway, something to hope for. So I guess our last thing to talk about, and I'll touch on it now because I'd like to, if you're going to say anything about it at the event in September, we track a regional affordability index. So something we think about a lot, it's income, mortgage rates, and the price of the house in the formula. And it's never been worse, I guess is the right way to say it. In some of our markets, it's tracking in the 50s. So median income is somewhere like half of the income necessary to buy a median priced home. How would you advise or talk to a broker about educating them about how to talk to people about affordability?
Yeah, I mean, affordability is a difficult topic because it's worse that it's been, and by many measures, it's the worst it's been in 40 years, in over 40 years. Like the worst time that we had it was during the last inflation boom or in 1980s. So by that measure, it's very difficult to buy a home. And I'll agree it's very difficult to buy a home. But what I think is helping is that inflation has slowed and it's continuing to slow. I think mortgage rates will come down. Lower mortgage rates obviously means better affordability. I think that as long as the labor market remains healthy, we're not going to be creating 300, 400,000 jobs every month. It's unreasonable. It's unsustainable.
It still feels like recovery, from what we just went through and figuring out the work at place and work from home and people moved all like crazy.
Yeah.
It feels like that'll settle down.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, exactly. And it has started to. And I think, as long as we're not shedding jobs, and we're not shedding jobs, even with this latest report that sent everybody freaking out to say in technical terms. Yeah, it was, 120. And so as long as we're not shedding jobs, that means on the net, more people are getting jobs than losing jobs. And when you have a job, you're able to save, you're able to make those monthly expenses. And so, and wages will start catching up as well in terms of inflation. You're going to start exceeding the inflation increases, which means on the net, the real income is up. So all that will help people. I think we are actually in the middle of this spring was the worst. I think anything going forward actually starts looking better.
So rates were just spiked like that. Yeah, it's a three-legged stool, with those three things, and two of them do seem to be improving. So on that note, Selma, it's on the rates ticking down and things looking up, we'll kick it off over to the event September 19th, where we get to have you in town to PropTechSouth.com. So thanks for recording this with us today, and we'll see you in September.
Yes, I look forward to it. Thank you so much again for having me, and I'll see you later in September.